3 weeks before Mira Vason learned the truth about herself, she had already broken the first rule. The rule was simple, carved into the bones of every Omega in the Ashvale pack, before they were old enough to understand why. You do not enter the King's Archive without a summons. You do not touch the iron door at the base of the Eastern Tower. You do not ask what is kept behind it. The vault, as everyone called it in whispers over dining tables and in the quiet corners of the training yards, was not a place for people like her. It was a place for records, for history, for the cold accounting of decisions made by men and women who sat on thrones and decided the shape of other people's lives. Mira had broken the rule because of a smell. She knew how that sounded. She was 26 years old, a secondary archivist with ink-stained fingers and a reputation for being thorough to the point of obsession, and she had pressed her palm flat against an iron door that could have gotten her exiled because something on the other side of it had smelled like rain-soaked cedar and old grief. It was not a rational explanation. Nothing about that first night had been rational. She had been working late, cataloging donor ledgers from the previous century, and she had taken a wrong turn in the labyrinthine eastern wing. Or that was what she told herself, though some quieter part of her knew she had been drifting toward that door for weeks, pulled by something she did not have language for yet. The door had not been locked. That was the detail that stayed with her, the one she turned over in her mind like a river stone, smooth and strange. Every other room in the archive required a key or a blood press, or at minimum a sealed letter from the Chancellor's office. But the iron door at the base of the Eastern Tower had swung inward at the pressure of her palm, with a groan that sounded almost like relief. She had stood in the gap for a long moment, the warm amber light of the main corridor behind her, and the cold blue darkness of the vault ahead, and she had told herself she would only look. She would only step inside far enough to see what the smell was. She would leave in 30 seconds. She had been inside for 3 hours. The vault was long and narrow, cut into the bedrock of the tower's foundation, and its walls were lined floor to ceiling with iron filing drawers, each one labeled in a typeface so small she had to bring her face close to read it. The cedar smell came from the wood panels between the drawers, ancient and dark, and the grief, well, the grief came from what was inside them. She had pulled the first drawer open almost at random, the one at eye level nearest the door, and found files, clean white folders, each one containing a single Omega's documentation, a name on the tab, a photograph clipped to the inside cover, a summary sheet beneath that. She had read 3 of them before she understood what she was looking at, and then she had stood very still, with a folder in her hands, and felt something cold settle into her chest. Rejected. Every file in this vault contained the record of an Omega the Alpha King had met and rejected during the formal assessment process. Some of the rejections were recent, the dates on the summary sheets going back only 2 or 3 years. Others were older, spanning back to King Calder Ashvale's grandfather, who had begun the practice of formal Omega assessment as a way of selecting a mate with scientific precision. The king would meet a candidate. He would assess her. He would, in the language of the official forms, determine compatibility. And if he found her wanting, if the bond did not spark, if some quality he was looking for was absent, her file went into the vault, quietly, permanently, without, as far as Mira could tell, the Omega herself ever being informed that a file existed. She had spent the next 2.5 hours reading. There were hundreds of them, hundreds of women who had come to Ashvale Citadel for entirely ordinary reasons: trade negotiations, scholarly appointments, festival attendance, and who had, at some point during their visit, been assessed by the king or his representatives without their knowledge or consent. The summary sheets were clinical and brief: physical descriptors, scent profile, bond response rating on a scale of 1 to 10, and at the bottom of each page, a single word in the king's own handwriting: insufficient, or unsuitable. Or, for the women who had clearly come the closest, who had rated 8s and 9s on the bond response scale, not her. Mira had read every one of those. Not her, not her, not her. The king's hand a little more jagged each time, a little more pressured on the page, as if the words cost him something even as he wrote them. She had been about to leave, to slip out and pretend she had never been here, when she reached the drawer at the far end of the vault. It was the only one that was slightly ajar, as though someone had opened it recently and not pushed it fully closed. She had almost ignored it. She had almost been sensible. Instead, she had crossed the cold stone floor and pulled it open, and there, at the very front of the drawer, the most recent file, the tab date stamped only 19 days ago, she had found her own name. Vaesen, Mira C., Secondary Archivist, Ashvale Citadel. She had stood there for a very long time. Her photograph was inside, a candid shot, not a posed one, taken from what looked like a slight elevation, from the gallery above the main reading room perhaps, where she often sat at lunch with her notes spread around her. She was looking down at a page, and her hair was escaping its knot, and she looked entirely ordinary and entirely unaware that anyone was watching her. Her scent profile was listed. Her bond response rating was a 10. And at the bottom of the summary sheet, in handwriting that had pressed so hard through the paper it had almost torn it, were 2 words she had not expected. Not yet. Not insufficient. Not unsuitable. Not the cool dismissal that filled every other file in the vault. Not yet. She had replaced the folder precisely as she had found it, pushed the drawer almost closed, and walked out of the vault on legs that did not quite feel like hers. She had gone back to her quarters, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and thought about those 2 words, until the sky outside her window went from black to gray to the pale pink of early morning. Not yet. It was not rejection, but it was not acceptance either. And somewhere between those 2 things was a question she did not yet know how to ask, about a king she had never spoken to, about a bond she had not known she possessed, about a vault full of women who had been assessed and filed away without their knowledge, and about the fact that she, alone among them, had been given something other than a final verdict. That had been 3 weeks ago. In the time since, Mira had not returned to the vault. She had done something more dangerous instead. She had started watching. Calder Ashvale was not what people expected when they thought of an alpha king. He was not loud. He was not performative in the way that power sometimes made men. He did not fill rooms by announcement, did not require the attention to follow him when he walked. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in the way of old bloodlines, with dark hair that was starting to go silver at the temples, even though he was only 33, and eyes the color of deep water, not quite gray, not quite green, changing with the light. He moved through the citadel with a deliberateness that Mira had initially read as coldness, and had since come to understand was something else entirely. He was always watching. He noticed everything. He simply chose, with great care, what he responded to. She had compiled this assessment, the way she compiled all her assessments, systematically, with evidence. She had begun noting his routes through the citadel, the times he appeared in the corridors adjacent to the archive, the way he paused outside the reading room door 3 mornings a week before continuing to his own offices. She had told herself she was gathering information, making sense of a situation she had stumbled into. She had not let herself look too closely at the fact that she found reasons to be in the reading room on those 3 mornings, that she had started arriving early enough to have her notes spread out before him when he passed, that she had, once, only once, in an unguarded moment, looked up from her work and caught him standing in the doorway, not passing but stopped, watching her with an expression she did not have a name for, and felt something in her chest pull toward him so hard it frightened her. He had looked away first. He always looked away first. She had begun to understand what not yet meant, and it made her furious in ways she could not fully articulate, even to herself. Because the vault existed, because hundreds of women had been catalogued without their knowledge, because she was apparently among them, rated and filed and deemed, what? Worth waiting for? Worth some undisclosed future consideration? Because she had been assessed without her consent and given a number, a 10, and placed in a drawer, and the man who had done it was 300 meters away right now, making decisions about the governance of 7 packs and 14,000 people, and he had never once spoken to her, and she did not know if she wanted him to, and she could not stop thinking about those 2 words in his handwriting, and she was beginning to suspect, with a dread that tasted very much like anticipation, that the bond the summary sheet had identified was real, and was active, and was pulling at her from across every room she shared with him, whether she liked it or not. She did not like it. Or rather, she did not like what it meant that someone else had known about it before she did. It was on a Tuesday, gray and rain-soaked, the kind of autumn day that made the Citadel feel like something out of an older century, that everything changed. Mira had been cross-referencing treaty documents in the secondary reading room when Petra found her. Petra Dawn was the head archivist, 50 years old and sharp as a letter opener, and she appeared in the doorway of the secondary reading room with an expression that Mira had learned, over 3 years of working under her, meant that something had happened which Petra was not entirely sure how to handle. "The Chancellor's office has sent a request," Petra said, and her voice was very carefully neutral. "They're conducting an audit of the vault, Eastern Tower. They want a secondary archivist on site for documentation support." Mira set down her pen. "When?" she said. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock." Mira looked at her hands on the desk for a moment. "Who requested it?" Petra paused, just a fraction of a second too long. "The Chancellor." Which meant, in Citadel political language, that the Chancellor had been instructed to request it by someone above him, and there was only one person above the Chancellor. Mira nodded and said she would be ready, and Petra left, and Mira sat very still for a count of 10 before she allowed herself to feel anything about this at all. He knew she had been in the vault. Of course he did. She had been naive to think otherwise. The vault might not have been locked, but it was certainly monitored. He would have been notified the moment the door opened. He would have known, within minutes of her entering, exactly who was inside and how long she stayed. He would have known what drawer she reached, what file she opened, what she had read. He had waited 3 weeks, and now he was sending her back. She spent the 2 hours before the appointment oscillating between an icy, clarifying anger and something she refused to name. The anger was clean and useful. She had been documented without her knowledge, assessed without her consent, filed away in a drawer, while the man responsible had been watching her through reading room doorways and writing not yet in handwriting that tore the page. And now he was staging a situation in which she would walk back into that vault as an official visitor, as if that changed anything, as if the vault's existence were something she could simply process as a professional task and set aside. The something she refused to name was less useful and considerably more dangerous. It had to do with the way his eyes changed with the light, and the fact that she had memorized his handwriting without meaning to, and the relentless, bone-deep pull that had only gotten stronger over 3 weeks of proximity and deliberate avoidance. She dressed with care. She chose the gray dress, the good one, because she was not above allowing herself to be seen clearly when she walked into a room that contained her own personnel file. The Chancellor's representative, a young man named Solis, with an immaculate suit and an aura of practiced discretion, met her at the base of the Eastern Tower at 5 minutes to 2. He gave her the documentation requirements, a formal inventory of all files added to the vault in the past calendar year, cross-referenced against the assessment records in the main archive. "Standard audit procedure," he said. "Nothing unusual." "And will the king be present?" she asked. Her voice was perfectly level. Solis looked at her with an expression that suggested he had been briefed about her, but not quite enough. "His Majesty may pass through," he said carefully. "The audit is a formality." The iron door opened as easily as it had 3 weeks ago. Mira stepped inside with her clipboard and her cataloging forms, and her anger held tight in her chest like a fist, and she went to work. She was 20 minutes into the inventory, methodical and efficient, when she heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around. She continued writing, her pen moving in its clean archival hand across the form, and she heard footsteps on the stone floor, measured, deliberate, unhurried, and the particular quality of silence that settled around those footsteps, as if the room itself became more attentive when he entered it. "Archivist Vasson," said the king. His voice was lower than she had expected. She had heard him speak in public contexts, across halls and assembly rooms, where it carried the shape of authority. This close, and she had not realized until his voice arrived that he was close. Perhaps 4 feet behind her. It was different. Private, like a sound meant for small spaces. She turned. He was in his working clothes, not his ceremonial ones. Dark jacket, no insignia. The silver beginning at his temples, catching the vault's cold overhead light. He was looking at her with those deep water eyes, and the expression she had seen in the reading room doorway, the one she had not had a name for. Up close she could begin to name it. It was a kind of reckoning. It was the face of someone who had been bracing for something for a long time. "Your Majesty," she said, perfectly civil, perfectly contained. He looked at the clipboard in her hands, then at the row of drawers behind her, then back at her face. "I understand you were here 3 weeks ago," he said. There was no accusation in it, which made it harder to respond to than accusation would have been. "I was," she said. "I entered without authorization. I read files that weren't part of my regular duties." She paused. "I read my own file." Something moved across his face. "I know." "Then you know," she said, and she heard the edge in her own voice and did not soften it, "that I have questions." He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality, she had noted in her weeks of observation, of a person who had trained himself to be still when other people expected him to react. It was a kind of discipline, and she would have respected it in the abstract, if it had not been deployed on her specifically, now, in this moment. "What questions?" he said. She laughed, short and sharp, because the question was so insufficient. "You can start," she said, "by explaining what this vault is." He looked at the walls around them, at the rows of iron drawers, with an expression that was not quite what she expected. It was not pride or defensiveness. It was something closer to exhaustion. "It's a record," he said. "Of women you've rejected. Of assessments," he said. "Formal and informal. The practice began with my grandfather. I inherited it. And continued it." He met her eyes. "Yes. Without telling the women involved." "That is the protocol, yes." She set the clipboard down on the small iron table near the door, with a precision that was just barely on the right side of controlled. "And when did you assess me?" He was very still. 8 months ago. 8 months. She had been in the Citadel for just over a year. He had assessed her 8 months ago, and written "not yet," and put her file in a drawer, and then proceeded to walk past the reading room 3 mornings a week for the better part of a year, watching her through doorways, and she had not known. She thought about all the mornings she had looked up, and felt that pull, and told herself it was just the draft from the corridor, just the particular quality of autumn light, just the way his eyes changed with the light. "Why not yet?" she said. Her voice was very quiet now. The anger was still there, but it had changed shape, become something more complex, and harder to hold. He exhaled. It was a small sound, barely audible, but in the cold stone silence of the vault, it landed like a confession. "Because you weren't ready," he said, "and because I wasn't sure I had the right." She stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, and she had spent 3 weeks imagining, that was not among them. "You have a vault full of rejected Omegas, and you're telling me you weren't sure you had the right?" "They weren't." He stopped, started again. "The rejections in this vault are genuine. The bond didn't spark, or it sparked insufficiently. That's a real thing, not a bureaucratic decision. For the women in those files, the assessment confirmed what both parties would have known quickly anyway. The vault is a poor way to handle it," he said, and she noticed that he did not flinch from the admission. But the assessments themselves were not cruelty. They were practical. "And mine? Yours was different," he said. "From the moment I was in the same room with you." He stopped again. He was not, she realized, a man who spoke easily about this. He was choosing words the way she chose words for formal documents, with great care and awareness of consequences. The bond response was immediate and complete, 10 out of 10 on every metric. That hasn't happened in Ashvale bloodline records for over 100 years. She absorbed this. And so you put me in a drawer. I put your file in a drawer, he said. Because a bond response that strong, in a woman who had no idea I existed, no context for what she was feeling, no preparation, using that to walk up to you and say what I would have needed to say, felt predatory. It felt like exactly what you're accusing me of. She looked at him for a long time. The vault was cold and still around them. All those iron drawers, all those filed-away women, and the king of the Ashvale pack standing 4 feet from her, with an expression of careful, deliberate honesty that she had not expected and did not quite know how to hold. You should have told me, she said, that a record existed, that I had been assessed. Yes, he said simply, I should have. The directness of it disarmed her more than any justification would have. She had been prepared for justifications. She had spent 3 weeks constructing arguments against justifications. She had not prepared for a man who agreed with her. She picked up the clipboard. Not because she was going back to work. They both understood the audit was a pretext, but because she needed something to do with her hands. What does not yet mean? She asked. Specifically, what were you waiting for? I wanted you to find the vault yourself, he said. She looked up sharply. I left the door unlocked, he said. 8 months ago, and every month since. I left it in your route through the eastern wing. I waited. The shape of the last year rearranged itself in her mind. All those late evenings working in the eastern wing. The drift toward the door she had attributed to habit or curiosity. The wrong turn that had never felt entirely like an accident. You manipulated my environment, she said. I created an opportunity, he said. I didn't open the door. I didn't pull the drawer. I didn't make you read. That is an extremely fine distinction. I know. She set the clipboard down again. Her hand was not quite steady. She was aware of the bond the way she had been aware of it in the reading room doorways, the pull of it. Except now she was 4 feet from its source, and it was not a drift or a tendency, but a full physical fact. A warmth in her sternum that had nothing to do with temperature. She hated it, and she was grateful for it, in equal and confusing measure. I need you to understand, she said carefully, that I am extremely angry with you. I know, he said again, and that my being angry with you has nothing to do with. She stopped, started. The bond is real. I've been feeling it for months without knowing what it was. That is its own separate problem. He looked at her. There was something in his face now that had not been there before. A kind of careful hope, banked and contained. The expression of a person who has learned through long experience not to let themselves want things too clearly. Tell me the problem, he said. The problem, she said, is that I don't know how much of what I feel is mine. She watched him understand what she meant. It moved across his face slowly, the way understanding moved across careful faces. An omega-alpha bond of this magnitude was not subtle. It was biological, inherited, woven into the oldest parts of pack genetics. It produced warmth and pull, and a particular kind of recognition that felt, from the inside, exactly like the feeling of coming home. The problem was that it was not chosen. She had not chosen to feel this. She had not chosen him. She had been sitting in the reading room, with her notes and her ink-stained fingers, entirely unaware that she was being watched, and something ancient and chemical and not quite voluntary had decided, on her behalf, that this man was significant, and he had known for 8 months. The bond amplifies what's already there, he said. It doesn't manufacture feeling out of nothing. Whatever you... He paused. Whatever you feel when you're near me, it's yours. You can't know that. No, he admitted. But I can tell you that I have not found it, in myself, to be false. What I feel is mine. It is inconvenient, and it is persistent, and it has nothing to do with what I decided, or chose, or wanted. It simply is. He looked at the wall of drawers behind her. Every other woman in this vault, the bond didn't spark, or it sparked, and died immediately. With you, it sparked once, 8 months ago, in the East Courtyard, when you walked past arguing with a stack of papers you were carrying, and it has not dimmed since. Not once. Across every wall I've tried to put between it. She stared at him. You were in the east courtyard 8 months ago. I was on the upper walkway, he said. You were below. You were reading while you walked, and you walked straight into a support pillar and swore very colorfully, and then looked around to see if anyone had witnessed it. She remembered this. She had been mortified. She had hurried away, as fast as dignity would allow. That was the moment? She said. That was the moment. She sat down on the iron table, because her legs had decided they did not want to hold her up through this particular revelation. The table was cold and slightly too high, and she did not care. I have 47 questions, she said. I'll answer all of them, he said. Not today, she said. Today I want to finish the inventory, legitimately, and then I want to go home and think. He nodded. He was watching her with that same expression, careful hope, held very still, and the fact that he was not pushing, was not leaning on the bond to press his advantage, was not using the obvious warmth between them to make her feel rushed, was doing something uncomfortable to her anger, not dissolving it. She did not want it dissolved yet. It was important, but it was changing shape again, becoming something more like the beginning of a negotiation between two people who had something real and complicated to figure out. There's one more thing, she said. Yes? The vault, she said. The protocol. The women who were assessed without their knowledge. He was very still. That ends, she said. Whatever else happens or doesn't happen between us, that ends. You find a way to reform the process. Consent-based assessments, transparent records. The women who were filed away without knowing, they don't have to be contacted. That would be chaos at this point. But the practice itself stops. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in the look that was not quite surprise, and not quite admiration. Something that occupied the space between those two things, close to both. All right, he said. I want it in writing, she said. All right, he said again. She picked up the clipboard. She uncapped her pen. She began to work her way through the inventory, with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to every cataloging task, and the king of the Ashvale pack stood quietly near the vault door, and did not leave, and did not speak, and the cold blue silence of the room held them both in it, and the bond between them burned steady and low and patient, and Mira Vassin let herself feel it fully for the first time, let it run through her without fighting it, and found that it felt, under the anger and the shock and the complicated residue of betrayal, very much like something she had been looking for, without knowing she was looking. She did not tell him that. Not yet. She had learned, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that not yet could mean something other than rejection. It could mean, I see this. I know this is real. I am not ready to hold it in my hands, and I need time to decide what it means before I can carry it properly. It could mean, this is too important to rush. She worked through the inventory with her pen, and her forms, and her ink-stained fingers, and he stayed, and neither of them spoke, and the first thing was done. The second thing took longer. The 47 questions came in pieces over the following 2 weeks, not all at once, and not in the formal setting she had half imagined. Some parliamentary proceeding, in which she would present her grievances and receive satisfactory answers before a ruling could be made. They came instead, the way real understanding comes, obliquely, in the margins of ordinary life. He sent for her the day after the vault, officially, through the Chancellor's office, with a summons that was worded with such careful formality that she suspected he had drafted it 3 times. The meeting was in his working office, not the throne room, and it was attended only by his personal secretary, an older woman named Halvir, who gave Mira a look of sharp, assessing intelligence when she entered, and then found something to occupy herself at the far end of the room with great apparent concentration. The king offered Mira tea, actually made it himself from the small service on the side table, which she had not expected from a man who had armies of people to do such things, and asked, quietly, how she wanted to proceed. She had asked him then about the vault's history, not the defensive parts she already knew, the grandfather, the protocol, the inheritance, but the real history, the emotional history. Why had none of the 100-odd women in those drawers been sufficient? She had read the files, She had read the 8s and 9s, the near misses, the not hers. What was he looking for? He had been quiet for a long moment, turning his tea glass in his hands, and then he said, "I don't know how to explain this without sounding either arrogant or pathetic." "Try," she said. "The bond, when it's real, when it's full, it's not just physical recognition. It's not just chemistry. It's—" He stopped, started again. "There's a quality of attention, a particular way of being present. I have met women with every attribute my advisors recommended, women who were smart and strong and kind, and the bond sparked and rose, and then," he shook his head, "and then I talked to them, or watched them in a room, or saw how they moved through a problem, and the bond said, 'This is not the same thing. This is not her.'" "Not her," Mira said. He looked at her. "Yes." She thought about the summary sheets. "The king's handwriting across hundreds of bottom lines. That's what you were writing." "I stopped trying to explain the distinction after about the 40th file," he said. "Not her covers it well enough." "Until mine," she said. "Until yours," he said. "Which says—" "I know what it says." The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence in the vault. The vault had been a cold, stone silence, old and archived. This one was living. It had the warmth of the tea service, and the particular amber morning light through his office windows, and the sound of Halvir making very convincing work noises at the far end of the room. "I've been watching you for 8 months," he said, "walking your routes through the citadel, in the reading room, in the east courtyard. I know how you argue with documents when you think no one can see you. I know you take your lunch to the upper gallery, so you can read without being interrupted. I know you have been working on a cataloging system for the pre-partition treaty records that no one asked you to build, but that will save the next 3 decades of archivists a significant amount of work. I know," and here something shifted in his voice, a slight roughening, a fraction of self-disclosure, "that when I stand outside the reading room, and you haven't noticed me yet, and you're working, I feel more—" He stopped, collected himself. "I feel more like the person I'm supposed to be than at any other point in my day." Mira set down her tea glass carefully. Her heart was doing something she was choosing, in the interest of dignity, not to acknowledge. "That's a great deal of watching from doorways," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It's not the same as knowing me." "No," he said. "It's not. That's why I waited." She looked at him, the silver at his temples in the morning light, the deep-water eyes watching her with their careful, calibrated hope. "You understand," she said, "that I am going to spend the next several months periodically furious at you. About the vault, about the file, about 8 months of watching from doorways and not speaking. That is going to be a recurring feature of whatever this is." "I'm aware," he said, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in something that was not quite a smile, but was the raw material of one. "And you're not going to get to use the bond as an argument," she said. "Every time I'm angry, you don't get to say, 'But we're bonded,' as if that settles anything." "Agreed," he said. "Good," she said, and she picked up her tea and finished it, and he watched her with that not-quite smile, and Halvir continued to be extremely busy at the far end of the room, and the second thing had begun. The weeks that followed were— Mira would have used the word complicated if she were being accurate, or the word impossible if she were being honest, or the word extraordinary if she were being the thing she could not quite yet allow herself to be. She continued her work in the archive. He continued his work in the governance of 7 packs. They met in the mornings in his working office, formally at first, with Halvir and her magnificent discretion in attendance, and then more informally, as the formality became insufficient for the nature of what was actually happening, which was 2 people learning each other, with the careful intensity of people who know that what they are learning matters. She argued with him, often, and with full commitment, about the vault reform. She had opinions about the consent protocol and how it should be structured, and she was not shy about presenting them. About the pre-partition treaty cataloging, because she had discovered that he had an active interest in pack historical records, and he had opinions about her cataloging methodology that were wrong, and she told him so. about a border mediation he was managing with the Fernwall Pack, in which she had read the relevant documents and had a perspective that was, she maintained, more historically grounded than the one his advisors were offering. He listened to all of it. He did not always agree. When he disagreed, he said so directly, with reasons, which she respected even when it infuriated her. He learned her. She felt it happening, the accumulation of small observations, the way he remembered things she mentioned and brought them back later, the way he tracked the shape of her thinking, the way she tracked the shape of his governance. He brought her coffee from the kitchen rather than tea on the mornings when she was tired, having apparently memorized, without comment, the fact that she switched between them based on how much sleep she'd had. He began leaving relevant treaty documents on his desk, in the order she would find most useful when she arrived, which was a different order than his staff would have used, and demonstrated a working knowledge of her methodology that she found more disarming than any formal gesture could have been. She brought him arguments. She was constitutionally unable, she discovered, to spend time with someone whose work she had opinions about, and keep those opinions to herself, and he was someone whose work she had opinions about. She brought him a 17-page analysis of the Fernwall border mediation's historical precedents, which she had written on her own time, because the alternative was just thinking about it uselessly. He read it the same day she gave it to him. He implemented 2 of her recommendations. He told her, with the careful precision of a man choosing his words, that it was the most useful document he had received from anyone outside his formal advisory council in 5 years. She had been standing in his office doorway when he said this, already on her way out, and the bond had done the thing it did, the warm pull in her sternum, and she had stopped and looked at him for a moment too long, and he had looked back, and the air between them had been very full of things neither of them had said yet. She was not ready. She knew she was not ready. The anger was still there, in its changed and complicated form, and the question of what was mine and what was the bond had not fully resolved, and she was still cataloging things, still building her understanding, still needing the thing to be seen clearly before she could decide what to do with it. He knew this. He did not push. He stood at the appropriate distance and met her eyes across appropriate rooms and waited with a patience that was, she suspected, costing him considerably more than it appeared to cost. She heard about him from other people too, which was a different kind of knowing. She heard from Halvir, who had become, in some quiet and mutual way, an ally, that he had been under pressure from the Pack Council for years to select a mate, that the vault and the assembly process had been a response to that pressure, that there were council members who had specific candidates in mind and had been becoming increasingly explicit about their expectations. She heard from Petra that there was talk in the Citadel about the new audit of the vault, that people had noticed things were changing, that the word reform was in the air. She heard, from a junior archivist who had no idea of the significance of what she was reporting, that the king had been seen in the Eastern Archive 3 times that week, which was unprecedented, and that he had spent most of a Tuesday afternoon reading pre-partition treaty documents in the main reading room, which was where Mira worked. She had not been there on that Tuesday. She had been in the secondary reading room. She thought about that for longer than was strictly rational. The confrontation, and it was a confrontation, though it wore the clothing of something more formal, came on a Thursday evening in the 5th week after the vault. His name was Arden Solke, and he was on the Pack Council, and he was 45 and handsome, and very convinced of his own importance, and he had come to Mira's small office in the archive's East Wing with the particular air of a person who believes they are doing someone a favor by condescending to visit. He had heard, he said, sitting across from her with his hands folded, that she had become a regular presence in the king's morning schedule. He wanted her to understand the situation she was in. He wanted to help her avoid making a mistake. Mira had put down her pen and given him her full attention, which was not comfortable attention. The situation, as Solka described it, was this. King Calder had been under council pressure to formalize a mating bond for 3 years. The council had a preferred candidate, a woman named Isel Navar, daughter of the Fernwall Pack's senior administrator, which would resolve the border situation neatly and consolidate political alliance. The council had been working toward this for 18 months. Any outside attachment the king formed was, Solka said delicately, an obstacle. Mira said, "And you've come to tell me this because?" Solka said, "Because you're an intelligent woman in a vulnerable position." Mira said, "I appreciate the characterization." Solke said that she should understand that a secondary archivist, regardless of any personal connection, was not a politically viable mate option, that the king's first obligation was to his pack, that whatever she imagined was developing between them was subject to larger forces than either of them controlled, that she should consider, carefully, whether she wanted to continue in a direction that would ultimately end in disappointment for her, or, depending on how far things had progressed, something more significant than disappointment. It was a threat wearing the clothes of advice. Mira had encountered enough of both to tell the difference. She said, "Thank you for your perspective," and she meant it in the way that it is possible to mean a dismissal. Solka left. She sat for a while, and the cold, clarifying anger was back, cleaner than it had been in the vault, because it had a clearer target, and under it, the bond was steady and entirely unmoved by political considerations. She did not go to the king that evening. She thought about Isel Navarre and border mediations, and the way power arranged the world to serve its own continuance. She thought about a vault full of women who had been handled as political variables. She thought about Not Yet and what it meant now, 5 weeks on, and what it had cost him to write it. She went the next morning, earlier than usual. He was already at his desk when she arrived, before Halvir, which was also earlier than usual, and she thought he might have been there for some time. "Solke came to see me," she said. Something crossed his face, a rapid, controlled darkening, and then went still. "When?" "Last evening, in my office." The control he was exercising was visible to her now, in a way it had not been 6 weeks ago. She had learned enough of his face to read the difference between stillness and suppression. What did he say? She told him. She was accurate and complete. He listened without moving. "I should have anticipated this," he said when she finished. "You should have told me about Navarre," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "I should have." "Is it true that the council wants this match?" "Yes." "And Navarre herself?" He was quiet for a moment. "She's willing. She's practical. There's no personal attachment on either side. It would be a functional arrangement." He paused. "The bond would not be present." "Meaning you'd be bonded to someone else's mate," Mira said carefully. "Meaning I would be bonded to no one," he said. "The Navarre match would be a political contract, not a mating bond. It's possible to formalize a relationship without—" He stopped. "Without the bond being involved. For people who don't have a bond." Mira thought about this. "And people who do?" He looked at her. The deep water eyes, and the careful hope, and something else now. Something that had moved past hope, into a territory she recognized from her own interior landscape. The particular vulnerability of a person who has decided they can no longer afford the distance they've been maintaining. "For people who have a bond," he said, "the bond does not go away. It would simply be," he searched for the word, "unconsummated, permanently, an open circuit." She thought about living with the pull of it, the warm, steady weight in her sternum, for the rest of her life, directed at someone who had signed a contract with someone else. She thought about what that would cost. She thought about what it would cost him. "Calder," she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned to. It arrived in her mouth as a consequence of something that had shifted in the last 30 seconds, some decision being made at a level below conscious thought. She saw him go very still when he heard it, the way a person goes still when they have been waiting for something for a long time, and it finally arrives. "I need you to tell me," she said, "what you want, not what the council wants, not what the political situation requires, what you want." The silence that followed was the longest silence they had shared, longer than the vault, longer than the mornings with Halvir in the corner. He looked at her, across his desk in the early morning light, and the careful hope in his face came open like a door. "You," he said, simply, without the construction of justification around it, just the word, given plainly. I want you. I have wanted you since the moment in the East Courtyard, and I have wanted you through 8 months of open doors, and not yet, and reading room doorways, and I want you with a clarity that has nothing to do with the bond, and everything to do with who you are, and I understand that you are angry with me, and that you have questions, and that this is complicated, and I am prepared to work through all of it for as long as it takes. But you asked me what I want, and that is what I want. Mira sat with this for a moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat. The council, she said. Solke, the Navarre situation. I will handle the council, he said. That is not your problem. It will become my problem if you handle it. Then we will handle it together, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had put her file in a drawer, and written not yet, and left a door unlocked for 8 months, and made her coffee when she was tired, and read her 17-page analysis the same day she wrote it, and stood in reading room doorways, and felt more like himself. The man who had not pushed, who had agreed with her about the vault protocol without defending himself, who had said I should have told you plainly, and without excuses. The man who was looking at her right now, with everything visible on his face, no management, no distance, just the honest shape of wanting her, and knowing it, and waiting. The bond had known from the moment in the East Courtyard. Mira had known, she thought, in some part of herself that had been smarter about this than the rest of her, for almost as long. The anger was real and valid, and it was not going to disappear by decision. The questions were real, and some of them were still unanswered. The vault was full of women who had been handled imperfectly, and that required sustained work to address, work she intended to be part of. All of that was true. And underneath all of it, the bond burned steady, and she had asked herself 100 times over 5 weeks whether what she felt was hers, and she knew. She had known for a while, if she was honest, that it was. The bond had pointed. She had looked at what it pointed at, and found a man who listened, and argued, and waited, and told the truth, even when the truth was unflattering to him. That was hers. That choice was hers. She stood up from her chair. She walked around his desk. He had turned to face her, and she was standing close to him now, closer than the reading room doorways, closer than the vault, close enough that the bond between them was no longer a pull, but a warmth, full and steady, like a fire that had been banked for months and was finally being given air. She put her hand on the side of his face. His eyes closed briefly, the way eyes close when something long-awaited finally arrives. Not yet, has an expiration date, she said quietly. He opened his eyes, the deep water color of them, this close, in the morning light. Yes, he said. Yes, she said. Now. She kissed him. It was not the dramatic, consuming kind of kiss that the bond might have made it, or maybe it was exactly that, and the drama of it was just very quiet, the way he went still, and then came alive under her hand, the way his hands found her face with a carefulness that felt like reverence, the way the warmth in her sternum expanded outward through her whole body and settled there, a permanent feature now, no longer a pull, but a presence. She felt, in the middle of it, the bond complete, not spark and arc and supernatural fire, but something quieter and more permanent, like a key finding its lock, like a sentence finding its final word. He held her afterward, her face against his neck, his arms around her, and they stood in his office in the morning light, and did not speak for a while, and the silence was neither cold nor archived. It was the best kind, the kind that does not need filling. Eventually, he said, into her hair, the council is going to be a serious problem. I know, she said. Sulky specifically. I am not afraid of Sulky, she said. He pulled back enough to look at her. There was something new in his face. The careful hope had been replaced by something that had no need of carefulness, something open and lit from within. I know you're not, he said. That's one of approximately 400 things I... He stopped. Go on, she said. He looked at her steadily. Love, he said. It's one of approximately 400 things I love about you. She absorbed this. The word, plain and given directly, without the construction of a more cautious phrase around it. "You've been counting," she said. "I've had 8 months," he said. She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and she felt him respond to it, the way he had responded to very little that she had seen, with a full and unguarded ease. She thought that was perhaps the best thing she had learned about him, that his laugh was not performed but arrived, occasionally and suddenly, like weather. "The council," she said, returning, because she was a practical person. "How bad will it be?" "Significant," he said. "Solko has 3 allies on the council, who have been invested in the Navarre match for political reasons. There will be a formal challenge. There may be a PAC assembly vote on the matter." He paused. "I want to be honest with you about that. It will not be quiet. I have read every political document in the Ashvale archive going back to the partition," she said. "I know more about this PAC's legal and procedural history than anyone currently serving on the council." He looked at her. "I'm just saying," she said. "I know you're just saying," he said. "It's one of the 400 things." The council challenge came, as predicted, within 10 days. It arrived in the formal language of procedural objection, a question of the king's authority to establish a mating bond outside the formal assessment process, which was, Mira noted to Calder with some enjoyment, rather awkward for them to object to, given that the formal assessment process was the thing she had demanded he reform. The council, she suspected, had not fully thought through the implications of using the Vault's protocol as the standard against which her situation was being judged. Calder's PAC council sessions were not public events, but the outcomes were. Mira heard, from Halvir, from Petra, from the junior archivist with her gift for useful overheard conversations, how the meetings went. Calder had gone in with the bond documentation, the official record, which she had not known existed in the main archive as a counterpart to the Vault file, but which demonstrated the 10 out of 10 rating and the genetic compatibility analysis and the historical precedent of a full bond response in the Ashvale bloodline. He had made the legal and dynastic argument with characteristic precision, not allowing the thing to become emotional. He had faced Solke's 3 allies and the political pressure of 18 months of Navarre planning, and he had not moved an inch. Halvir reported that he had been, in Halvir's professional opinion, magnificent. Mira asked no further questions about the specific compliment because she was not yet prepared to examine what it did to her to hear it. The challenge took 11 days to resolve, through a formal PAC assembly vote in which the council's objection was brought before the assembled representatives of all 7 PACs and addressed in full session. Mira was not present for the vote itself. She had not been invited, which she had opinions about, and which she set aside in the interest of the larger context. She was in the reading room when it happened, which was where she was when she needed to think clearly, and she spread her pre-partition treaty documents around her and worked with the focused intensity of a person who is very good at not watching the door. Calder came to find her himself, after. He walked into the reading room, not pausing in the doorway this time, not watching from the gallery, walked directly to her table, sat down across from her, and said, 6-3. The motion failed. She let out a breath she had been holding, off and on, for 11 days. "Solke? We'll continue on the council," he said. "He's too politically useful to remove without cause, and losing a vote is not cause. But he understands now where the limit is." She nodded. "Navarre?" she asked. "Her father has been contacted. She was informed that the direction had changed. I'm told she received the news practically, which is consistent with everything I know of her." He paused. "I'm sorry that she was in this position." "As am I," Mira said, and meant it. She thought of the Vault, of women handled as variables. "The consent protocol for formal assessments goes to committee next month," he said. "I'd like you on the committee." She looked at him. "I'm a secondary archivist. You're the person who read every file in the Vault and identified its structural problems in approximately 3 hours," he said. "I want you on the committee." She thought about it for approximately 1 second. "All right," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, which was ink-stained, as it generally was, and he held it as if it were something he had wanted to do for a long time. She looked down at their hands, and then up at him. "We are going to have a very complicated life," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm going to continue working in the archive. I wouldn't have it otherwise. I'm going to continue having opinions about pack governance that your council will find inconvenient. That," he said, "is one of the 400 things." She looked at him across the reading room table, with her treaty documents spread around them, and the autumn light coming through the high windows, and the bond settled deep in her chest, and she thought about 3 weeks ago, when she had sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and turned 2 words over in her mind until morning. Not yet. She had thought then that they were a verdict, a conditional dismissal, a holding pattern. She had been wrong. They were something else entirely. They were the shape of a man who had found the thing he had been looking for his whole life, and had been careful with it. Imperfectly careful. Flawed careful. The kind of careful that required years of rebuilding trust and reforming protocols, and a secondary archivist's willingness to be angry at him and stay anyway. She squeezed his hand. He looked at her with everything visible on his face, the way she had come to know him, open and lit, no management, just the honest fact of loving her and knowing it. "Tell me the rest of the 400 things," she said. He laughed. "Weather, sudden and real." "We'll be here a while," he said. "We have time," she said. Outside the reading room windows, the Citadel went on about its business. 7 packs, 14,000 people, the long machinery of governance and history, and accumulated decision. The eastern tower stood quiet. The vault was inside it, its iron drawers full of files, waiting for the committee that would determine what to do with them, what to preserve, what to close, what to mark as the last record of a practice that would not continue. Not a destruction, an ending, and a change. The iron door was unlocked, as it had been for 8 months, and there was nothing behind it anymore that needed hiding. And in the reading room, a secondary archivist with ink-stained fingers sat across a table from a king who had watched her walk into a pillar and known, from that moment, that she was the one, and they held hands over pre-partition treaty documents, and the bond between them was quiet and complete and entirely, undeniably theirs. Not yet had become now, and now, it turned out, was the beginning. Mira did not become the kind of person she was not. She remained meticulous, argumentative, frequently ink-stained, constitutionally incapable of leaving a disorganized archival system alone. She joined the Consent Protocol Committee and was, by all accounts, including her own, extremely useful and occasionally exhausting to work with. She finished her pre-partition cataloging system and presented it to the full archive staff, and Petra watched the presentation with an expression that contained, in approximately equal measure, professional satisfaction and the look of a person who has seen something they expected, coming from a long way off. She continued to have opinions about pack governance, and she continued to share them with Calder, who continued to listen with the focused attention of a man who has discovered that the most useful thing in his life is a woman who argues with him honestly. He did not become the kind of person he was not, either. He was still deliberate, still watchful, still moved through rooms, with the careful attentiveness of a man who understood that power required custody. He was still slow to speak in public, and precise when he did. He was still the king, with all that the word carried, the weight of 7 packs and 14,000 people, the decisions that had no clean answers, the governance of a world that was older and more complicated than any one person's intentions. He was still, sometimes, the man who had built a vault and filed women into it, and called it protocol, and he carried that with the seriousness it deserved, working on the committee alongside Mira, building something better out of the ruin of the old practice. And he was, quietly and persistently, and with great care, hers. On the morning 3 months after the vote, Mira arrived at his office, to find not Halvir in the corner, but a document on the desk, not a governance document, or a treaty, or a council briefing, a single page, in handwriting she knew, pressed into the paper with the same force as the words in the vault, the words that had started everything. It was a letter. She read it standing up. It was not a formal letter. It was not diplomatic or political, or careful in the way that his speech sometimes was. It was the record of 8 months, laid out plainly: the east courtyard, the reading room, the unlocked door, the not yet. It was an accounting, and a confession, and at the end of it, a question. She stood for a long time with the letter in her hands. When Calder came in, he had been, she suspected, outside the door, with more willpower than was strictly comfortable. She looked up at him, and he looked back at her across the morning-lit room, and the bond between them was the warmest it had ever been, which was saying something, because it had been warm for months. "Yes," she said. He crossed the room and kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that did not require a name, that existed outside the language of protocol and vault records, and not yet, and the long machinery of deliberate waiting. Halvir appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later, looked at them, and said with magnificent composure, "I'll hold your 9 o'clock." Mira, her face against Calder's shoulder, said, "Thank you, Halvir." "Of course," said Halvir, and left them to it, and the morning light continued to move across the floor, and the bond was permanent and steady and full, and the 400 things were just the beginning of a list that would take a lifetime to finish, which was, all things considered, exactly the right amount of time.